We are in the last session, and in my view, this is going to be the most interesting because we have already heard people speak exhaustively about what ails the competitive regime today. But looking forward, how would it pan out and what is going to be the response is going to be the job of the magicians, and I have four of them here with me who will now gaze at the crystal ball and tell us what lies ahead for us. I have Dr. Ratin Roy on my left, who is director of NIPFP. He has done some very pioneering work, path-breaking work on how the economy works, especially in the case of India, and how and which of course also questions how we define consumer in a manner of speaking. Who is a consumer, and is it limited to a set of people who are subset of the population, or it must include everyone? I have to the left of Dr. Ratin Roy, Mr. Amit Kapoor, one of the finest minds in the area of regulation, regulatory law, and infrastructure and regulatory law, who is not just a very, eminent and acknowledged and recognized lawyer, but also a first-rate analytical mind who brings all his experience standing on his feet before the bench to sitting with us in this conference. On my right is Mr. Alan Asher, who is Chair, Foundation for Effective Markets and Governance from Australia. We have heard him earlier. He is also a very eminent practitioner and thinker in the field of how the markets must be governed for the maximization of the furtherance of the interest of the consumers. And then we have Mr. Bipul Chatterjee, who is Executive Director of CUTS International, who has been doing the grunt work in the area of competition, regulation and law for a very long time, and has also published a lot in this field. Alice Pham from Vietnam, who's the resident representative of CUTS, will be the rapporteur. Now, what we are going to do is as follows. We are going to, each of the speakers here will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes. Closer to 5, maximum 7. They've agreed to pay $50 for every minute they take more. And then the rapporteur, of course, is going to speak for 6 to 7 minutes. Indian speakers will have heavier penalty because they understand my accent better than the others. And after that, we will open it to the floor, because I think we'll have a much more interesting and vibrant discussion about this subject when it is a greatly agitated audience who hears everybody and thinks everyone has been talking nonsense, and then brings up with a lot of questions on that. Before we start, let me just throw 4 or 5 issues that I wish will also agitate our minds a bit. First, today the structure of capitalism and also wealth formation itself is under great questioning, and the interface between capitalism and democracy is also under great strain. And I think when we look at competition, when we look at welfare of the consumer, when we look at regulation, etc., this foundational issue needs to be also looked at again. The second is this great paradox which is arising because of the digital rise of a digital economy, which is the paradox between inclusion and exclusion. Whereas at the same time we are expanding inclusion in a manner that had never been possible before. But because of, but there is another strand, which is the exclusion of a very large number of people because of the selectiveness of the digital platforms in different ways, and we will look at it that. Third is bending of the human will, which is happening in the case of, for instance, the big data analytics. This morning, Dr. Parakal had also spoken about this, how the big data is being used to bend the consumer choices in a manner which is sometimes quite frightening. I remember very long ago, in fact it was 20, 30, 40 years, 35 years ago, when we had heard of this case in the United States, that when the people were watching movies, there were these very small clips of when you're hungry, drink Coca-Cola, which would go with the film, and you couldn't see it with your eyes, but your subconscious registered it. So when there was an interval, people got up, they felt thirsty, and they went for Coca-Cola. And this was then through regulation they came up and said this cannot be done, because, but today it has become much more subtle. It is even more difficult to be able to discern it, and very quickly new ways are found to circumvent any kind of regulation that you can bring around it. And finally, I think something which I had spoken about yesterday, which we need to understand, is that whereas we are very focused on competition, expanding competition, the economics of competition per se, we need to look at it in the larger perspective of how these have an implication of the bigger issue of how it responds to financial sector or financial systems in different countries. We've seen this, as I mentioned yesterday, in the case of 2G, in the case of coal block cancellations, how it has had a great overhang on the banking system, which in turn had an impact on the non-banking or shadow banking system, which in turn has had a problem of credit flow to consumer, and therefore consumption becoming flat or falling apart in the case of India. So I think these are some of those bigger, broader issues. When we look forward into the future, we will need to keep these into mind. And without going further into it, I am going to now request Dr. Ratin Roy to first speak. Would you like to? Or would you like to take it later? Oh, I'm sorry, my fault. First, of course, the rapporteur is supposed to give the base paper, right? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Mayaram. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm given the very difficult task of repeating whatever has been said since morning in 5 minutes. And I know that, and I hope that you all know that you all struggle to say whatever you want to say in 10 minutes. And now I have to summarize everything in 5. But Dr. Mayaram has given me another 2 extra minutes because my co-rapporteur regrettably cannot be on this panel. So without further ado, let me just dive right into it. So we started the morning by, we started the day with the first session by putting our fears on the table. I think the session deal with a couple of very generic problems from a global context. We talk about our worries and our fear and our confusion regarding the increasing level of market concentration that are being caused and witnessed by the advance of big techs in the market all over the world. We talk about issues related to digital dominance, and I'm not talking about dominance just from the perspective of antitrust, because it's not just the sheer sign or the control that these big companies have over the functioning of the market, but also the kind of power that they have to manipulate our preference and our life. We also talk about issues such as algorithmic collusion of pricing. So what to do about all these new things, all these fears that we have? The speaker in the morning talked about, I think we all agree that even though these are new issues, these are new challenges, but we all agree that we should not lose sight of the traditional or the fundamental problem that we have been facing so far. And to somehow resolve these challenges, we need a different a balance and equal policy mix between different kind of policy, including competition policy, consumer protection regulation, pro-competition regulation, for example. The speakers in the morning also talk about issues such as the need to build trust, to ensure that there's responsible business practice among the big tech. We also debated about the need to have new tools, or whether the current tool can be adjusted to address this issue. Another critical issue is the timing of the intervention. We don't want to intervene too soon to kill off innovation, but we also don't want to be too late when the market is already deep, given the fast speed of change. So that's the first session. Then coming to the second session, going from the global context, we move to the special case of the developing countries. We had a panel who all talk about the multiple benefits that we have been getting from the technological advance all over the world. I cannot count how many of them are there. There are lower choice, better consumers information, etc. But the speakers also mention a lot of downsides or risks that the developing countries are facing. We talk about grave issues such as digital colonialism. We talk about country going back to the protectionist approach of leaning toward industrial policy and promoting national champions instead of promoting competitive market. We also talk about the issues of developing country suffering from small size, and as a result have very little bargaining power against these giant technology companies. We talk about the effects of the disruption in the job market and how technology are depriving people of employment. We also talk about the distribution of gains, and all these problems are on top of the technical difficulties that competition authority and regulatory agency in developing country have to grapple with when they deal with technological issues. So what we do about that, how to overcome all these challenges by developing country. The speaker talked about the need to have a more proactive participation of developing country in the standardization process, in the technological standardization process all over the world, so as to turn developing country into standard setter instead of standard takers. We also talk about the need for international cooperation and exchange of ideas amongst competition authority in the developing world. We also talk about the need to educate consumers, to help them to understand not just the benefit but also the harm that could come of consuming all those technological products. The speakers also talk a lot about the tension, the remaining tension between the US and the EU approach in vis-a-vis competition policy and law. And in fact, this might be the opportunity for developing country to carve out a third approach where you take into account developmental goal while not just designing competition policy and law but also enforcing it. And this resonates very well with what has been said yesterday in the opening session, where many of the speakers talk about the need to focus the design and the enforcement of competition policy and law and regulatory policy to redirect it and redesign it to be more in line with developmental goal. The third session that just happened right now, we talk about the interface between competition and sector regulation in the online world. I think we talk about this because digital technology has not only transcend border but also transcend the boundary amongst the sectors. So that's why right now we have a platform and companies that are not only providing one type of products but are providing several type of products and are operating in multiple markets at the same time, allowing them to aggregate their powers and leverage this power beyond just economic matters into political and social realm as well. And that's why we might need to have interagency coordination, a stronger interagency coordination and cooperation between the sector regulators and competition policy and law. The panel also debated a lot on the role of sector regulator versus the role of competition authority, and whether both of them are still relevant or one should be given more priority as compared to the other. Finally, I hope I have not exceeded my time allocation. we talk about the need to have more market study to study on these issues that we are scared of, we are confused about, and to understand it more, and to have in place panel of experts to study on this problem. And I would conclude my rapporteur report by one quote that I like very much from you, ma'am. When you said that we have no immediate answer to all these problems, but that is for the future, to maybe for this panel to gaze into the crystal ball and tell us. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Dr. Roy?
Thought I could go at the end, but I'll go at the beginning. Okay, so that was very helpful. Yeah, because I'm coming in late, so I don't know, where to come in. So maybe I don't want to cover other people's ground. So if people could, so give me a minute to come back at the end, and I'll take 4 minutes now. How's that? So when I first was invited to this conference, Shagufta knows I was a bit confused. I know nothing about online. I'm not a great fan of sustainable development, and I don't understand. I'm not a great fan of the word development, actually. I don't understand the developing world outside a political context. So, and I battled with this all my life in the UN. Possibly that's why I left. So let me start, since this is a regulation conference, by asking a question which will help me navigate forward. How many people in this room have heard of an economist called Paul Baran or Michael Sweezy? 1, 2. Wow. Man, you guys need to go back and read these people, because you are talking about the things they were talking about 50 years ago. Is my distinct impression I got from the rapporteurs conference. It's okay, they were communists. It's probably why you haven't read them. But they were pretty good economists. And essentially what they said coheres very nicely with how you deal with these issues and the tensions you have, and that's my first point. Look, you have to understand, both in public finance and in international trade, that's why I don't like the word developing country world. Developing world is okay. Countries are a distortion. Countries are terrible things. Because if you were one society, one world, then we wouldn't have to worry about country policies, right? But countries exist for whatever odd reason, post-Westphalian reason. And therefore, the entire study of international trade, and for that matter, public finance and economics, is a study of distortions. Now, what Baran and Sweezy said was that monopoly capital was a natural outcome of the rise of the multinational corporation, because in addressing country distortions, what you sought to do was maximize profits, and you could not maximize profits if you were bound by country regulation, so it makes perfect sense to go ahead and create global monopolies. And that has happened time and again. But that, if you like, economic angle of attack, which I think is very persuasive, thou shalt have monopolies, because capital is concentrated, and therefore investment is concentrated, and particularly when you talk about the knowledge economy, R&D investments are concentrated, and when it is returns coming to those who can buy mines globally, the returns will go to places where those mines can be bought, which is California, Seattle, Japan, and London. That being the case, the irritant that countries pose by putting individual regulation cannot be justified by any economist, because then total global surplus value is reduced by such regulation. Because the reason you're regulating is you're saying implicitly, I want to trade off global profit maximization for individual equity in some entity called the country. We're not talking about global consumers, we're not talking about global young people, we're not talking about global grandmothers. We're talking about Indians, Malaysians, Malawians. And I'm sorry, I know it's impolite, but this makes no sense in economics. Economics is about the maximization of profits, value, output, surpluses. But regulation, in the main, particularly now, is a country level business. So you're going to have to live with this. And in a world of asymmetric power, you're going to get monopoly capitalism. We've had it since the war. It changes forms. It moves from Ford to Bill Gates. It is fundamentally good economics to have monopoly capitalism. And therefore, your struggle against it is a struggle to carve out equity. Because monopoly capitalism may maximize surplus. It doesn't tell you who gets it. And that is what concerns you. The small guy, the little guy. But economics doesn't care about the little guy. Because the second theorem of welfare economics tells you that if you're so worried about all that, that's why I don't like SDGs. I mean, I don't mind SDGs, okay, please have them. Then after you've done all your money making, let's put up a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, let's have philanthropy, and let's take money from people who are not involved in making money and give it to them. Your problem is some people didn't make money and some people did. That's the entire philosophy of aid, charity, philanthropy, right? And it's very popular. So you have to, so when you are talking about competition regulation, the future of the developing world, this needs to be, I think, understood. Second theme, relative prices. Fundamentally, the debate about regulation and competition is this. Do you, for any normative reason, believe that relative prices are unfair? And if so, do you accept that coercive power should be used to intervene to change those relative prices? If you're a good economist, you will not believe this, because you should not believe that there ought to be a minimum wage. Why should you have a minimum wage? Should you have a minimum price for bananas? Should you have a minimum price for oranges? Should you have a minimum price for labor? No. But note that one particular price, the price of capital, is regulated by every central bank in the world. So it is not as if relative prices are not regulated when it is believed that it is in the national interest to do so. So I think a lot of the discussion, the economics discussion on regulation, should actually be about intervening in relative price. I'll give you one quick example from India. In India, I believe the farmer is paid too little, but is paid too little to an extent that their entire livelihood and living is disempowered in the national interest so far, because we're a country, right, to grow more food. Because otherwise we would starve, because the United States wouldn't give us food if they didn't like our Pakistan policy or our China policy. So they would kind of dump it in the sea. So we said, let's grow more food. Now that's not efficient. It's much more efficient to import food from the US and give it to my farmer. So we said, grow more food. But as a consequence of doing that, food prices in this country are way too cheap compared to, say, the price of petrol or the price of this, well, till yesterday, right? So I need, for the farming business to be successful, I need relative prices to move in favor of agriculture, but that counteracts the national interest objective of giving everyone cheap food. Now that's a classic regulation issue where there's no wrong or right. And we'll have to understand what we regulate and why we regulate, in the interest of the consumer or the farmer. I think a lot of regulation in India is about the regulation of prices. I think a lot of regulation in many countries is about the regulation of prices. Just having this discussion with the aviation regulator, I said, I don't know why you exist. Why are you existing? I don't give a toss whether Indigo fails, falls, rises. Who are you protecting here? I don't get it. No. We must protect the aviation flyer in India. Why on earth should you protect the flyer in India? You know, why on earth should you protect somebody with a, anyway? You may have reasons, but those reasons fundamentally to realize are not about intervening in the price of air tickets, but in relative prices. And so when you do sector regulation, you take that space completely out. So really, what we should be discussing in aviation regulation is, are air tickets too cheap compared to rail tickets? Should they be more expensive and railway tickets cheaper in the public interest of providing affordable mass transportation? And then you will get a series of answers which you will not get if you're sitting there with a mandate just to be an aviation regulator. So my second point is, I don't know if this came up in the discussion, I did hear some cadences of it. I think a lot of the research has to now go into looking at relative prices. My penultimate point, the big global issue, and that's why I don't like sustainable development when it comes to finance, which Dr. Bairam brought up very nicely, is a very simple issue. You see, it's a fact of economics that if you have capital, you are going to invest it in ways that you make a profit. Now you have this puzzle in the world, you know, the total stock of global savings in the world, by the way, annual global savings accretion is $7 trillion a year, right? Sorry? Yeah, $7 trillion a year. And that $7 trillion a year is more than enough for your SDGs and your Paris and whatever disability rights you want to spend, from all the numbers I've seen. Sigma is enough. It's not going there. Here's the second problem. If you're an old chap sitting in Japan, you're going to earn 1%. If you put money in India, even today, you're going to earn 6%, maybe 5.5% tomorrow. You're still making 5.5% clear, but you'll keep your money stuck in Japan and Europe. Why? When the Japanese or the Europeans invest here, like say in solar panels, the game in technology and online is that old people own the patents and the old people live in the OECD. And you have to pay for their old age. That's their problem. But the young people live here. So the deal we are doing, and if regulated in this context, is how to get young people in poor countries to pay for the old age of old people in rich countries. And that is what the price of technology mediates, because what they control is not capital. What they control is returns to technology and R&D. And it's a legitimate quest. I've got a bunch of old people sitting in Japan. Who's going to pay for them? There are no Japanese to pay for them. There are no young Japanese. They don't earn enough. So Indians have to pay for them, but Indians need your money. And so that discussion is the discussion that informs finance. My final point is on competition and culture. I think here, I don't know how this is going to be dealt with, but sociology is very important, surely. And one thing I have found repeatedly in the economics of competition and regulation is the complete absence of the word sociology in understanding how countries can regulate better. That is why I also dislike this business about developing countries having the right space. Developing countries will never have the right space to be, it's an asymmetric word. They're not powerful. They're developing countries. That's why they're not powerful. If they were powerful, I've seen this in my life. When I was 20 years old, nobody gave a toss about India. You went outside, people talk about elephants and all. Now they talk about India as a very powerful country because we have money relative to what we had in the past. Tomorrow the Central African Republic has money. Everyone will call it a miracle, and Bangui will become a hot tourist destination. So that's how the world works. So in that context, therefore, the sociology of how people respond to regulation and whether they approve of it or not, I think becomes very, very important. In India, for example, there's a very high tolerance, socialist tolerance, for regulation that equalizes prices. In other countries, there is not. So I think in the preamble to regulation, we need to define what the sociological parameters are and then create the economics based on that and perhaps the law. That, for some reason, does not happen, and I wonder why. Thank you.
Alan, this was very provocative. I don't know how you could accept this coming from Australia. I mean, all this kind of a development economist talk, I mean, not development economist, non-development economist talking like this. Would you like to step in now and say something? I mean, tell him where he's wrong.
I'll happily do that, but it won't be to comment on Mr. Roy's remarks, but instead to consider the issue of gazing at the crystal ball. But let me say too that I'm not going to do that either, because we don't have time to be gazing at crystal balls. Now is the time for action, not gazing. And during the last 18 months, there have been 9 major international studies that have looked at aspects of the digital economy and the various things that we've been speaking about. They include the CAN-Cross report from the UK, the Furman report also from the UK. There are reports from the EU, a working group of the FTC in the United States, a major study in Australia by the ACCC, and others that I can refer you to if you'd like. Tons of empirical data covering all of the things that we've been discussing. So I've also listened to the presentations from today, and in the next 5.5 minutes, I want to give you some of the takeaway messages. These are not gazing at the crystal ball, but calls to action. The first, though, is to frame it that sensibly we should always ask ourselves whether we're applying the appropriate test of regulatory impact analysis. And that demands of us that we ask ourselves the question of whether there are demonstrated problems to be dealt with. And if so, do they require intervention, or is intervention just going to add to costs rather than reduce them? Having done that, we should make sure that anything that we do has more benefits than costs, and that we should also be aware of any unintended consequences of what we do, this industry in particular, because of the foreclosure problems that can arise. Finally, and actually the most important part of our regulatory impact analysis should be to be humble and recognise that we know so little about many of the issues that we're dealing with that we have to be much more open to self-correction and to criticism of the things that we're doing, so that we can learn and do a good job. But having said that, what are the takeaway messages that I would give to people? Well, the very first one is that this is not something that should be done or contemplated at a national level. Inherently, the online world, as Pradeep said earlier, and Mr. Roy just now, that the notion of arbitrary bits on a map that are called countries really don't influence markets of an online kind, except where there are regulatory barriers, and so that our responses preferably would be global. That's probably unattainable. Certainly they should be regional, but where that's unattainable, sub-regional or even bilateral. I've just finished working for 10 months in the 10 ASEAN countries, looking at ways of getting them to cooperate in some of these cross-border areas, and there is a real appetite for that. Not that it's easy, but it's necessary that our approaches and actions be coordinated in that way. The big issue that I'll raise first is the laws and institutions that we have to deal with these things. In the case of competition laws, for dealing with the contemporary online issues, merger standards have to be dealt with. Thresholds have to be capable of dealing with potential competition and not just a measurable current substantial lessening of competition. We should have pre-notification rules that allow authorities to understand and have time to research these issues to protect the market, not to come up with false positives, but nor to let things slip by. We should also to realise that the effects of many of these mergers are multi-jurisdictional, and that no single country will have the power to get all of these things sorted out. Laws should be there for data portability and to be making them interoperable, so that these issues and privacy might be protected. Some of the principles that we should apply to our thinking is that there is no inherent reason why online laws and consumer protection should be any less than offline ones. And as people have spoken about today, still 75 to 80% of the global economy is offline, and we still have an opportunity to preserve some of those standards. Some other competition and consumer protection issues for these purposes must be integrated. I come from a country, Australia, where the agency has always been integrated and has never had difficulty in understanding that competition applied without regard to consumer protection will fail. Consumer protection applied without the principles of competition will be wasteful. And so that when it comes to a test like consumer welfare, it's really no difficulty for such a country to say, well, of course that's going to involve quality, safety, performance, durability, a whole range of price and non-price issues which are well able to be assessed, and that when we take into account these tests, that doesn't present us with that sort of a difficulty. We also need to know, though, that consumer principles that need to be applied start with things like access, and that around the world, one of the most profound problems isn't so much the pricing of platforms, it's mere access to any of the platforms. It's also true for electricity, water, all the essential goods and services, and that we have to have regard to measures that will provide access to financial services and online services, broadband services, to as large a proportion of the population as we can. And that means sometimes the sacrifice of the lowest price to middle and upper income consumers, but that's part of the access principle of consumer rights, as is safety and other things too. When it comes to the institutions that administer this, I've worked now for 45 years for regulatory and non-government organisations, and as I said earlier, most regulators fail most of the time, and that's partly because of a lack of cogent civil society agitation. And I'm delighted that this conference has been sponsored by one of the most activist non-government organisations in the South, and that it's only when there is constantly holding governments to account, both nationally and regionally, that real progress can be made. Governments always give in to the big end of town if there isn't considerable accountability keeping by consumer groups and other consumer activists. And so advocacy, transparency, digital literacy, they're all tasks that non-government organisations can perform far more effectively. On the civil society side, the action speaks louder than words. Regulation is required, but the timidity with which most agencies approach it is rather shameful. Huge amounts of resources go to regulators who constantly tie themselves in knots. Just in this last 2 weeks in Australia, which in many ways has a good regulatory system, the major financial services regulator had allowed a major bank to break the law 23 million times with foreign transfers that weren't checked, money laundering, money to terrorist organisations, and all sorts of other things. So enforcement, regulation, having institutions and laws that are up to the task are vital to us. I urge everybody to look at those reports that I mentioned and commit themselves not to gazing into a crystal ball, although we do need to think about our work, but to set specific time-bound targets for doing these things, get these matters on the agendas of the multilateral agencies. Let's see if we can get the next IGE of UNCTAD to deal with this, both in a consumer and competition area. Let's get it on the agenda of the OECD and others, and not let them be browbeaten by the highly paid consultants from the big end of town, but instead to bring forward some actual development and consumer-oriented policies. That's my 6 minutes.
Thank you. So, Amit, you are now in a very judiciously elevated position to speak, because we have heard here someone who says that regulation of economic activity is actually a perversion, and so it is not only difficult, but it completely distorts. It's a management of distortions. And on the other side, we have heard now saying regulation should not be timid, and it should be something which really goes out there and gets them. So as a officer of law, but also somebody who understands the limitations of law, how would you react to that?
And shall I start by saying that, just quoting Tom Peters, because I have had two economists speak before me. And he said economists could fix everything effectively and efficiently. It weren't for the damn people around. That's the very problem. So I agree with Rathin that yes, the human race started in caves, but then we got organized. And as we got organized, unfortunately, my nose had to begin before your stick end. It couldn't have been that your stick could poke into me and I would live happily with you. And then from there to the hamlet, to the city, to the country, is unfortunately that distortion of human reality, which doesn't allow us to run naked in the street and throw spears at each other. So that's so much for organized living. Now that's a distortion that we have inflicted on ourselves because we live in an organized system. So that's one problem. It was not that the first human, Adam and Eve, were meant for living in hamlets and organized structures and elected representatives. But moving on from there, and I'll come to the question that you posed, but let me address myself 2 or 3 fundamental issues that have risen over the last day. I was very interested to hear Sangeeta Verma yesterday, and of course Geeta today, hark back to the competition law and policy, and keep talking about the lack of policy, competition law being adequate to answer questions. And at that point, one wonders that when the entire competition law and the regime is oriented to look at pure economic impact, ignores welfare. As a lawyer and a constitutional lawyer, how do I ignore Article 39 in the Constitution that requires you to maximize welfare, to optimize your natural resources, to prevent monopolistic abuse? because there are various elements of market design in the early days as the digital technology throws to us data, where market structures and distortions will come not because there are pure economic impacts. Today we are talking about lack of data. So the question and the call for action Alan gives us is that, do we sit back till we get Puritan data to then decide what to do? Or do we start engaging and evolving and be nimble-footed as we go along to achieve the ends? And so far as I'm concerned, I have not that bad a challenge as Ratin has, because I am not in blue sky thinking. I am still governed by the Constitution. And the Constitution does put the citizen, rather than the consumer, at the heart of it. Now, if it's the economy and the citizen, if it's the natural resource of the country, notwithstanding the issue of the country being a distortion in itself, should our entire regulatory mechanism and philosophy be oriented to consumer? And if so, at a given point in time, as we saw in telecom, from voice to data to several tiers of evolved value chains, if we started locking down at the first instance, would we create more distortions by only focusing on consumer today? And that is at the heart of what we see today. Please, I think my colleague mentioned earlier in the morning, and a thought that resonated with me. Today, the biggest influence that the digital media and data has on the representatives, elected representatives of the citizen, is how many tweets and how many followers. And with that influence, they control the minds and hearts of those men. They even control the hearts and minds of several judges who sit in Supreme Court to rule. Now that becomes a hell of a challenge, because now you have a circular scenario. So the guy who wants to judge and define for you is the one who is worried that he's getting judged simultaneously. And then in this circular world, you need to start playing around a little more carefully. So my suggestion to you is threefold. Number one, call for action is a given. Number two, I wish we were in the Puritan world where all countries went away and we were open charter in terms of natural resources and the movement of natural resources, men and capital and technology. But we are not there. If we are not there, we are also at a time where the post-Bretton Woods world is crumbling. Much that we would like to talk about multilateralism, as Alan brought home, multilateralism is facing a huge challenge. Regional connects and regional regulation also looks very ambitious, not real. It is more bilateral, it's more sub-regional, it's more group of countries developing some kind of a common harmonious existence. So a group of people through the elected representatives, if countries is a distortion in our minds, to come together and deal with the reality that there is today 7 companies around the world that control 75 to 80% of 15% of the global GDP through data. The ability of them to influence, control and govern what you and I do, what our representatives do, and how things are arranged is at the heart of the matter. So the question is, I completely agree that ideally there should not be the level of controls on capital that we have, because it does bring in a lot of impairment. It does put in wrong signals, it does prevent growth. Redistribution might be a better deal, and we may look at it from a different angle. I'm not sure philanthropy is the answer, but there are other ways of doing it. And perhaps more emancipated corporate governance, which is now being talked about in the new economy and the thinking of the last few years. But more than that, a more alive civil society and a deeper engagement of the regulatory field and the world on a day-to-day basis, in a more engaging manner rather than behind closed doors, coming out once in a while, to evolve. Because this speed of change in data and digital technology is so quick that nobody other than those 7 and 10 have an arm around it. It's the most amorphous, fast-moving amoeba that anybody's figured out yet. And you still need to, because that's the amoeba that you ride. It's not a tiger anymore. And that's a hell of a challenge. I mean, riding a tiger is bad enough. But if the tiger has the shape of an amoeba, which changes every few hours and a few days, it's very, very difficult to put a frame around it and say, okay, from here, the next 5 or 10 years are going to look like this. So we need to really redesign ourselves, our thinking, our ability to engage with the reality that comes up, and to deal with it. I'm not sure whether we can wish away that fast change of technology and the need for innovation. I'm not sure that we would like to wish away the welfare gains that you would get by reaching that man in hinterland who has no access, or the lady, to medicine otherwise, to be able to get medicine, livelihood, education. And yet, would you allow that to be then abused? I mean, it's something which has been discussed during the day. And unless we are able to engage with this in a far more proactive and a deeper manner, where I think civil society needs to come on the table. In India particularly, and around the world, I don't think the civil society and the voice institution has really been brought up. And unless that is brought out, unless the citizen is actually empowered to understand what's going on and deal with it. And that empowerment must come through an institutional mechanism, quite like what you have as a CAG or some other institution straight under the parliament, with independent funds and abilities, with access to technology, expertise, both legal, technical, and economic. We will always have a challenge of chasing the train that left the station 2 years ago. And that's where the big data is the big challenge. You know what GDPR was. We have all witnessed the various testimonies that came from CEOs of big data before the most powerful parliaments in the world. And we saw how they cocked a snook and walked away. We didn't know what the hell was going on. Nobody had any sense on, we were no better in terms of information and knowledge of what they were doing, where they were heading, and how we could regulate it better. So under the circumstances, I don't think there is any point in trying to put too much more to it than saying, need to engage deeper, develop stronger processes, and keep at it on a consistent basis. Not to impair, but to get more conversant and to be able to take the shaft from the brain. You need innovation, growth, and you want to keep away from the deleterious impact. I don't think there is any formula that one could offer today. But unless we engage with it, if you're going to go back to our respective corners and write our small pieces, we are not going to find the answer.
Thank you. So, so I think, yeah, greater connect between the regulators and the world, not just the economists. So, Vipul, what are you going to be telling us today? Are you going to be looking ahead, looking behind? How?
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me begin with a confession that before attending this event, I was not aware of the nuances, various nuances of the online economy or digital economy, except the fact that willingly or unwillingly I am a part of it. I mean, I am using it, however small it may be. But after hearing all of you, I not only that I have started a little bit of understanding of the subject, but I also feel like an expert, except the fact that I do not know that I do not know. Now I am going to focus on 2 or 3 or maybe 4 specific points which came up over the last couple of days in our discussion, and also some of my thoughts, in order to just throw some ideas about the future work which we could do in this space. Of course, also covering my colleague Alice, she has very nicely covered the major points that we discussed today, but I'm also going to touch upon some of the more macro but important points which came up in our discussion yesterday evening. The first thing which I wanted to talk about is that whether we like it or not, these online things or digital things, they are having an impact on our life. In the sense that couple of weeks back there was internet shutdown in Jaipur, from where I am, many of us are. And I was at a loss because I was unable to check my mails or look at my WhatsApp and YouTube and so many other things. So this is how I am looking at this digital economy, and how it is going to, is already shaping our lives, and how it is going to shape our life in future. Now the question to me is that over the last 2 days, we are talking about the need for regulations, need for the application of competition law to regulate this sector for the betterment of consumer welfare and also for producer welfare and the societal welfare as a whole. But I am not very sure whether we are clear about the products or the markets which we are talking about. Every other day, we see that there are new features which are coming on these platforms or about these platforms. There is update which we receive in our phone. And so how are you going to define the market, or how are you going to define the product or a service? I don't even know whether this digital economy or the products which we are getting from there, whether they are services or they are utilities. So are we also using them, these apps, various apps, as utilities for the betterment of our life or not? So these are some of the questions which are coming to my mind, and I think the purpose of this program is to raise questions, not just to find answers to them. And if we can raise some questions and frame them properly, I think we have achieved our purpose. Now, the second thing which is coming to my mind, if I look at the top global corporations, the top two, each of them, their value is more than $1 trillion. Taken together, they are almost 10% of the size of the Indian economy, and Indian economy is quite big. It's third largest in the world. So the question is, are they too big to fail? Now suppose, I can take one or two names here. Suppose there is no Amazon tomorrow. So how is it going to affect our life? Suppose there is no Google tomorrow. So our Gmail, our internet, our email system, everything is gone. We don't know how to reach from here to Paharganj, for example, to New Delhi railway station, for example, unless we are familiar with this city. So I don't know, I mean, whether these companies, they are too big to fail or not, but I think, though I am not sure that given the fact that the rapid changes which are happening in this space, every day we have new features, new products, or new way of delivering services which are coming, I don't know how feasible it is to regulate them in that sense, right? By the time we study a new feature, the kind of regulations which are needed, something else is coming. Now, given that, and when we have a competition law, and I'm a bit surprised in this, by hearing this, that most of our competition laws in our countries, they are quite old. So they are not that dynamic. Well, the sector is very dynamic. The tools which we are going to use to regulate the sector is more or less static. And this is not just for, I think, the developing world. I guess in the developed world also, it's more or less the same kind of situation as far as competition law is concerned, or regulatory laws are concerned. So how are you going to deal with this situation? That's another question which is coming to my mind. So competition law reform and the kind of reforms that we need, that's something which we need to think about. I understand that India has come out with this competition law reforms committee. They have come out with a report, and we have also submitted our comments on that. So how this report is going to deal with the digital economy space, that's something which is very, very important for us to understand. My next point is a bit larger point, is that I want to go back to the basic, the internet. And I don't know how the competitive world is there in the internet space. What kind of intellectual property rights regime is used to govern the internet space? What kind of standards which are there to govern the internet space? I think given all this, it is very important for, and I'm taking from what Amit has said just now, the role of civil society organizations or consumer organizations, citizen consumers. I think we need to play a much more proactive role in internet governance of our countries. Not just in our countries, but also in at the global level. Last week we had this Internet Governance Forum in Berlin. I don't know what was the participation of consumer organizations in that forum. We are getting the daily brief through Diplo Foundation. I didn't see any participation of any consumer organization in that forum. It was primarily, not even developing countries, by the way, not much participation. Primarily it is the developed countries and the big business who are participating and driving the agenda. So as an activist, and this is what I learned from Pradeep, is that we have to, even if our knowledge is not that big, we have to get into that and then get the knowledge from various sources. I think internet governance is going to be a major thing for us to understand the future of the digital economy. Now, talking about the kind of future work program which perhaps we can develop in this space, I think I'll primarily draw from what George said yesterday and even today. There are a number of new concepts, two-sided market, for example. I don't know how many of us, even I don't know, I mean, to be very honest and frank with you, the definition of two-sided market. Huh? Multi-sided market. Multi-sided market. So if we can come out, and this is how we started, I remember about more than 2 decades back, when we started making serious interventions on competition policy and law, we started with the basics. And we started with a series of booklets called Myths and Realities. So we can note down, these are the basic issues on which we need to gain knowledge. We means not just consumer organizations, but also competition authorities, and also exchange knowledge among ourselves, and come out with small booklets, reader-friendly, using real or hypothetical examples, including numeric examples, to explain the concepts to us first and then to others. So I think that's something which we should do, and also see how we can help competition authorities to exchange information among themselves, to develop their capacity to understand these new issues. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is something which International Competition Network, ICN, should take up in their future work, instead of talking about some esoteric things. Now, my final point is that we are also witnessing, I mean, in any case, the life is very, very complicated, and it's becoming much more complicated. But there is further complication. I think we are also witnessing a new kind of digital divide. It's not just the digital divide within a country between those who are having good access to these new technologies through internet, or those who do not have good access, but the new kind of digital divide which is emerging out of this technology war. It's not just trade war between the US and China. Now my question is that, are we going to see the different standards, at least 2 different type of standards emerging, which is going to govern the digital economy in future? And I will stop by leaving you with a question, particularly for Alan, is that, is it possible for a country like Australia to have political or to depend on another big power, or one big power, for your political and military security, and while depending on another big power or emerging power for your economic security, particularly when these 2 worlds are intertwined in the digital space? So thank you very much.
Thank you. So we actually have this great complexity and challenge of time. I think what we are going to do now is to maybe just take 5 more minutes, maybe 7, for any questions. No, that he will at the end. So what I'll suggest is we have questions, but I would also suggest that if the panelists have a question to each other, I think it's a good time to be, bringing them up. So if there are any questions, please come up with them now, or we shall then open the wrestling match here at the table here itself. Anyone? Yep. Anyone? Okay, so let me ask Ratin before, and maybe you can then also take 1 minute with that. Ask you this question: we haven't spoken at all in the last 2 days on financialization of data. Should we be looking at financialization of data? Should we be going towards regulated exchanges of data? Like you have commodity exchange, you have equity exchange. Should we be looking at that? Is that something which is likely to happen soon enough? There's something that you could also perhaps speak on about.
No. So that
About the 1 minute, or?
no, you cannot have only because you data commercialization or putting a price to it involves a degree of banditry, and that's good. I like banditry. It's okay. So I grab your assets. I do it every morning, and then I sell them. But the consciousness that this banditry has huge externalities would prevent it from becoming a marketplace phenomenon quite the way you mentioned. So there'll have to be aggregators. That's already happening to some extent. And then we push back to the aggregators, and there I think I take all your comments on. On the Constitution, I have I'm going to use my minute to sort of respond to some very interesting points Mr. Kapoor made. Just 2 points. One, on your point of the Constitution, I take your point completely. But that does not answer the question of how. Do I increase my country's welfare by intervening in interpersonal equity questions? Or do I increase it by increasing the size of the cake? There's no correct answer, but that answer is very much there. I mean, recently I wrote an article saying that the minimum wage is a good idea for macroeconomic reasons. And people said, no, we don't like the concept of a minimum wage because your intervention is an equity intervention. That's an old debate in economics. But the point I want to make, it's very interesting. This morning, Ajay Shah was here earlier. They've written, Kelkar and Ajay Shah have written this very interesting book, which is relevant to the topic of this. And there's an interesting tendency in India. I wonder if it's there anywhere else in the world. Maybe we have so many engineers, where you take governance in India. I get the impression that governance in India, people think, will be solved if we just create one giant app and take all these corrupt bureaucrats and service providers away from the people, and then let people press the app and things will come to them. It doesn't work that way because of sociology. In the same way, when people say we must create institutions with the RBI and all, I call it the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen approach. But real politics is not like that. It is dirty. It involves war. Voice comes through struggle and political mobilization. And to say that we will deal with these extraordinary things that are happening purely by creating institutions means that you're confident that the elites you have in the country will be able to run this country, the oligarchies, by creating institutions that will serve the public interest. I am no longer sure in this country, and I can be quoted on this if this is not in camera, that our oligarchy is fit for purpose to do this anymore. I was confident 20, 30 years ago. I'm not confident now. The United States knows perfectly well its oligarchy is not fit for purpose. Right? Australia, I don't know. The UK knows perfectly well its oligarchy is not fit for purpose. That is why you're getting what you're getting there. In those circumstances, voice means struggle and political contestation and political mobilization. In the consumer affairs regulatory front, it is quite dramatic, the lack of political mobilization, even on stuff like education and health. So my question to you is, when will the language of politics enter the language of regulation? When fundamentally regulation is about contesting, I take your point, their power. And institutional development happens when you're confident that oligarchies can intervene in a peaceful way to mediate that power struggle in the public interest. But when oligarchies are patently unable to do it, then what will you do? It's a question that should worry everyone in China after what's happening in Hong Kong. You're from Hong Kong, enough to talk with you. Cup of tea after this. Should worry everyone in China. They have kept this thing under the lid for 40 years. Now what's going to happen? I don't know. Stop there.
There have also been very interesting attempts by some of the state governments to incentivize the consumer for different ways. And even take the case of Punjab, and the question of the free subsidy to electricity. You know the case. But that's an incentive. So within that oligarchy, because of communities coming up and raising certain issues, there is a voice that has come up. The point that you're making is that it's no longer the question of centralization, decentralization. It's a question of the community and the consumer. Consumer could be defined differently because that's, I don't know, between citizen and a consumer, I don't know anything. I just keep quiet there. But the problem that is coming up now is the tendency more for centralization than for allowing for this sort of decentralization. The oligarchy part of it is just control. And I don't want to explain further, you know what I mean.
But except to add, I will just that it is centralization by electoral consent. And that is the interesting part.
We'll have it over tea.
Electoral consent. Complete electoral, emphatic electoral consent twice tea. It's not like China, it's not like
Okay, so wonderful. We had a very thought-provoking, very interesting, often animated and agitated conversation here. I'll not recap because there are so many things, and actually when you're gazing at the crystal, you cannot be summarizing what you're gazing at because there is much more that you have to start seeing. So thank you very much. I think we have come to the close of this session, which is also the last session.